Welcome back to Diane Noah. If you're new here, this is the channel where the biggest stories unfolding right now get broken down clearly, honestly, and without the noise. No spin, no agenda, just the truth of what is happening. And today, that truth is one of the most sobering things I have covered in a long time. So stay with me, because this story matters. A massive wave of exodus has begun in Iran. Miles-long lines of vehicles stretching through the streets of Tehran. Broken glass scattered across the capital's roads, massive columns of smoke rising into the sky, the incessant sound of explosions, and in the middle of all of it, millions of ordinary people abandoning their homes, their neighborhoods, their entire lives, and simply running. Major cities, Tehran, Isfahan, and Tabriz, have transformed into massive evacuation centers. Thousands of vehicles are heading north every single day. According to data from the United Nations Refugee Agency, 100,000 people fled Tehran, a capital city of 14 million, in just the first 2 days of the war alone. Those with the financial means and the connections to get out are heading toward the Turkish and Azerbaijani borders. In just the first 10 days of the conflict, thousands of Iranians crossed the Turkish border, on foot and in vehicles. The Astara Gate on the Azerbaijani border has been under extraordinary pressure for days. Those who can leave are leaving. That is the reality. There are also those who crossed into Armenia through Azerbaijan. On March 12, 2026, UNHCR official Ayaki Ito reported that most Iranians were seeking safety, with 3.2 million people already having fled Tehran and other major cities toward the north and the rural areas of the country. With the conflict ongoing, that number is expected to keep rising, potentially triggering one of the largest forced migration events in modern history and a full-scale humanitarian crisis inside Iran. Tehran, a metropolis of 14 million people, is the epicenter of this disaster. People are taking refuge wherever they can find ground. In remote villages in the snowy mountains of Zanjan, in strawberry farms near Avaz, at the foot of the Alborz Mountains, and along the shores of the Caspian Sea. They are not choosing destinations, they are simply moving away from the fire. And here is something that gives this crisis a historical weight that is impossible to ignore. Iran has seen this scene before. When the Iranian Revolution took place in 1979, everything started exactly like this. People first left the country in small groups, then in mass. At that time, exactly 3 million people abandoned their homeland. But today, the numbers are on an entirely different scale. Estimates suggest that between 20 and 30% of Tehran itself may have already been emptied, because the attacks have primarily targeted the capital and its surrounding areas. This is being documented not by any single report, but by the physical reality on the ground. The traffic jams stretching for kilometers, the chaos at fuel stations, and the endless convoys of vehicles moving northward. At least 50 to 60% of those currently displaced are believed to be from Tehran. If the fighting intensifies, that figure is expected to climb to 5, perhaps 7 million people. The UNHCR has stated clearly that the numbers are likely to continue rising. But there is a dimension to this crisis that goes beyond the obvious. A striking and deeply revealing aspect of what is happening is this: even supporters of the regime are fleeing. Sections of the Iranian population that have been loyal to the Islamic Republic for decades, people who believed in the system, people who defended it, are now leaving due to insecurity, fear, and deep uncertainty about what comes next. This is not simply a migration of the opposition. This is a collapse of confidence from within, and at the center of that collapse sits one critical factor: the situation of the new leader, Mojtaba Khamenei. According to reports, Mojtaba Khamenei was injured in an attack within the first 24 hours of taking office as supreme leader. Some sources claim he is dead, others say he is in a coma. The regime describes him using the phrase Jan Baz, a term that implies someone who has risked their life. But his complete absence from public view is fueling a level of speculation that the regime cannot contain. For years, supreme leaders would appear on screen, speak directly to the people, and project an image of control and permanence. Mojtaba Khamenei was finally able to issue his first statement on March 12th, but it was only a written statement. No appearance, no address, no image. That is a first, and it is sending a message that the regime never intended to send. The leader's decision to stay off camera and issue only written words is accelerating the exodus in two distinct and devastating ways. First, it spreads fear, because it signals to everyone watching that the conflict is not winding down, it is escalating. Second, it destroys confidence, because even loyal Iranians, the people who would normally be steadied by their leader's voice and presence, are now without that anchor. The new supreme leader was the regime's last symbol of continuity. Now that symbol is silent, absent, and surrounded by rumor. And so the believers are beginning to flee alongside everyone else. But now here is something crucial. And this is the point where I want to pause, because this is the first question I genuinely want you to think about and answer. When you consider that even regime loyalists are fleeing, the very people who upheld this system for 40 years, does that tell you that something truly irreversible is happening in Iran? Or do you believe the regime still has the capacity to stabilize the situation if the military pressure eases? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to know what you think. This community is one of the most thoughtful places on the internet for this kind of discussion, and I mean that. Now back to the crisis, because the missiles falling from the sky are not the only thing emptying Iran from within. Behind the scenes, there is a much more insidious enemy that has been accelerating this process for years, and the war has now forced it into the open at terrifying speed. Ecological collapse, drought, misguided agricultural policies, decades of incompetent water management. These forces had already been silently destroying Iran's lifeblood long before the first strike. Even before the war broke out, Tehran's water reserves had declined by 45%. Daily life had already become a quiet struggle for survival for millions of ordinary Iranians. In years prior, this drought had forced rural populations to flee toward the major cities in search of water, resources, and basic stability. Now the direction has reversed entirely. The wind is blowing the other way, and it is carrying panic and destruction with it. Millions of people are simultaneously fleeing the war and fleeing the collapsing resource base, flooding north toward the more humid coastal regions. But those so-called safe zones, the northern provinces and rural areas near the Caspian Sea, have long since exceeded their natural capacity. They are rapidly buckling under the weight of an incoming population they were never built to support. Rural areas are creating their own internal disasters from the sheer pressure of overcrowding. Clean water, food, shelter, everything is being stretched past its limit. If the conflict drags on and this ecological bottleneck cannot be broken, the projections are truly alarming. With millions of people trapped inside the country pushing against the external borders, the total number of displaced is expected to reach 10 million. That is 15% of Iran's entire population. Not a crisis, an apocalyptic scenario, one that will not only overwhelm Iran, but will pull the plug on the entire region's humanitarian aid infrastructure at the same time. Now let's ask the hard question directly. Can Iran manage this crisis on its own? The honest answer is no, not even close. The possibility of the Iranian regime managing this scale of internal displacement alongside a simultaneous humanitarian emergency using its current resources is, at this point, beyond any rational analysis. The regime is not only fighting missiles from the sky, it is fighting the structural collapse of an apparatus it spent decades degrading through corruption, mismanagement, and political prioritization over basic governance. Iran's economy has long been crushed under severe international sanctions, historic hyperinflation, and a governance crisis that has compounded itself year after year. The Iranian rial's devaluation against the dollar has effectively emptied the state treasury. The billions of dollars in emergency funding needed to provide shelter, food, water, and health care to millions of displaced people simply do not exist in Tehran's coffers right now. And to all of this, add the water crisis, Iran's most pressing and most suppressed wound. Even before the war, Iran's agricultural and industrial heartlands, from Khuzestan to Isfahan, had been the scene of mass protests driven by catastrophic drought. Now, millions of people fleeing the capital and the southern conflict zones are pouring into the northern and western provinces, regions that were already suffering from their own water stress. Provinces like Mazandaran and Gilan, on the shores of the Caspian Sea, barely have sufficient clean water and food infrastructure for their own local populations. They are now being crushed under the consumption pressure of millions of sudden arrivals. This creates a deadly socioeconomic tension, a friction between local populations and incoming displaced communities that historically sparks social conflict, competition for resources, and a breakdown of local governance structures. So, even if the military conflict were to pause or ease tomorrow, could the regime bring these citizens home? The answer lies not just in the logistics, but in the deeper question of what those people would be returning to. Returning home is not simply a matter of opening roads and issuing announcements. It requires people to find a home that still exists, a job that still functions, clean water they can give their children, industrial facilities, energy infrastructure, and communication networks on the outskirts of Tehran have sustained severe damage. Repairing the electricity grid, restarting water distribution systems, and rebuilding supply chains will require months, possibly years, of intensive engineering and enormous financing. More critically, the public's contract of trust with the state has been torn. Mojtaba Khamenei's silence and the visible collapse of the regime's protective shield have erased any remaining perception of a safe zone in the minds of millions of Iranians. Even those who were loyal just weeks ago prefer to wait at borders, uncertain, uncomfortable, exposed to the elements, rather than return to a capital that is visibly failing to provide governance. The scale of internal and external displacement reaching 10 million people is not just a statistic, it is a declaration, a demographic declaration, that the Iranian state apparatus has effectively ceased to provide welfare and security for its own people. At this stage, the intervention of the international community, United Nations agencies, and regional actors is not an option. It is an urgent necessity. But how does humanitarian aid actually get into Iran right now? Its airspace is closed, its sea routes are blocked, its roads are under attack. Iran's connection to the outside world has been almost completely severed. This is where the land borders become critically important, and where the question of regional readiness becomes a matter of life and death. Turkey shares a 560-kilometer border with Iran's western and northwestern edges. That border is currently one of the only routes through which Iranians can connect with the outside world. The Kapakoi border crossing has become the single busiest transit point from Iran into Turkey. Turkish Interior Minister Mustafa Shahin announced that a 3-scenario emergency plan has been prepared to manage a potential mass migration wave from Iran. The first scenario focuses on managing the migration wave on the Iranian side of the border before it reaches Turkish territory. The second involves establishing tent cities and buffer zones along the borderline itself. The third covers settlement and absorption plans within Turkish borders. Turkey has real and tested experience in this area. It hosted nearly 4 million refugees during the Syrian civil war, becoming the world's largest host country for displaced populations. AFAD's logistical infrastructure, Turkey's disaster management authority, is one of the most advanced in the entire region. The Red Crescent's humanitarian aid distribution network has been tested and proven across Syria, multiple earthquakes, and major floods. But the Syrian experience is also a warning that Turkey cannot ignore. Turkey is still paying the economic, social, and political costs of hosting 4 million Syrian refugees. That presence has created deep and ongoing tensions within Turkish society. Public opinion is extremely sensitive to the prospect of a new, potentially larger wave of arrivals. Interior Minister Shahin's emphasis on managing migration on the Iranian side of the border is a direct reflection of that domestic sensitivity. Turkey is ready to help, but it is also determined to protect its own stability. There is also the separate and equally urgent question of delivering humanitarian aid into Iran itself, not just receiving its displaced population at the border. If a buffer zone is established on the Turkish border, that zone could serve as the origin point for a humanitarian aid corridor reaching into northwestern Iran. Food, medicine, emergency blankets, and basic hygiene supplies could be routed into Iran's West Azerbaijan province via the Gurbulak and Kapaköy crossings. Turkey's Ministry of Defense has already constructed a 380-kilometer concrete security wall, 203 optical surveillance towers, and 43 elevated observation posts along the Iranian border, infrastructure that can serve both border security and humanitarian logistics simultaneously. But there is a serious challenge embedded in this. The border region is under direct threat. Tabriz, located just 200 kilometers from the Turkish border, has been under heavy bombardment. Iran's air defense systems in the northwest have collapsed entirely. Ensuring the safety of humanitarian aid convoys moving through this territory requires active coordination between Turkey and the United States and Israel, a diplomatic challenge layered on top of an already overwhelming logistical one. Azerbaijan could serve as a second humanitarian corridor. Food and medical supplies could potentially be delivered into Iran's Gilan and Ardabil provinces via the Astara border crossing. But the obstacles here are serious. Azerbaijan-Iran relations are in a state of acute crisis following the attack on Nakhchivan. The Azerbaijani military is on full combat alert. Even if diplomatic channels technically remain open, the military tension makes humanitarian coordination extraordinarily complicated. And there is one more practical reality that applies to both borders: the severe congestion at every crossing point. With the start of the war, commercial traffic has almost completely stopped, but humanitarian aid trucks must pass through the same bottlenecks. If Turkey moves aid convoys, dedicated corridors will need to be carved out, separate from commercial lanes, with accelerated customs procedures, security guarantees, and war zone logistics planning. The same requirement applies on the Azerbaijani side, where the Astara crossing was already operating at capacity under normal conditions. And here is the sobering historical precedent. From Turkey's direct experience in Syria, when border crossings become bottlenecks during a humanitarian crisis, the suffering multiplies. During the Idlib crisis, the congestion at border crossings left hundreds of thousands of people waiting outdoors in freezing temperatures. The Iran crisis is heading toward the same scenario, but on a vastly larger scale. This is the second question I want to leave with you before we close, and this one carries real weight. If the displacement in Iran reaches 10 million people, 15% of the entire population, and the international community is unable to open reliable humanitarian corridors quickly enough, what do you think happens next? Does the regime use that suffering as leverage? Does it accelerate regime collapse? Or does it simply become a tragedy the world watches but cannot stop? Tell me what you think. Leave it in the comments below, because the people reading through that section are people who are genuinely thinking about this, and your answer contributes to that conversation. The shield of immunity that the Tehran regime built over 4 decades is now gone. The regime is not being destroyed primarily by its losses on the military front. It is being destroyed by the water reserves it dried up with its own hands, by the millions whose hope it consumed year after year, and by the 40 years of institutional corruption that hollowed out the state from the inside while its surface remained hard and intimidating. The miles-long lines of despair at border crossings and the insurmountable logistical strangulation do not simply represent a humanitarian crisis. They represent the actual shutdown of a state mechanism. People no longer look toward Tehran and see a protective authority. They see wreckage, the residue of decades of incompetence, ideological rigidity, and deliberate indifference to the basic needs of ordinary human beings. This massive demographic upheaval accumulating at the borders of Turkey and Azerbaijan is not just a regional problem. It is shaking the geopolitical fault lines of the entire region at their core. For Iran, the equation has shifted completely from the question of how to repel external military threats to the far more fundamental and terrifying question of how to survive in a rapidly disintegrating geography that its own people are abandoning in real time. Tehran's moves on this chessboard have long since been exhausted. The options are gone, the resources are gone, the loyalty is going, and the backbone of the system, the infrastructure of control, the mechanisms of fear, the apparatus of governance, is collapsing in full view of the 88 million people it claimed to serve. This is not the end of a war. This is the unraveling of a state, happening right now in the bodies of millions of people walking north through the mountains, waiting in cars at border crossings, sleeping in fields and on shores they never planned to reach. This is where the story is, and it is not finished yet. If you want to be in the room when the next chapter breaks, the most direct way is to be part of this channel. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell. You will know the moment something significant develops. This community is growing into something I am genuinely proud of. And before you go, please leave a comment. Tell me which of those two questions hit harder for you. Tell me what you think the next 30 days look like inside Iran. Tell me what this community is missing in the analysis. The comment section on Diane Noah is where the real thinking happens, and right now, this story needs it. I will see you in the next one.